The new king goes down to the cellar instead of putting on his crown. 200 barrels of sour ale. The butler tearfully begs him to pour out this filth because it's a disgrace to the entire castle. But the king lifts the lid, he sniffs it, he tastes it, and he orders that not a single barrel be poured out. To understand why, let's go back an hour. The cold hits Ian in the face like a bucket of ice water. He opens his eyes in a shaking carriage and doesn't recognize anything. Not the ceiling, not the smell, not his own fingers, they're someone else's. Long, pale, with calluses in the wrong places. In his head, someone else's memories unfold of their own accord, and each one repeats the same thing. Ian Callahan, the last of the collateral branch, the sole claimant to the throne of the dying kingdom of Holmgard. An orphan, no wife, no friends, only a letter with a seal in his pocket and the road to the castle where people he has never seen are waiting for him. The carriage comes to a stop. A soldier in a patched cloak throws open the door and says the castle is ready to receive the new king. Ian steps out and sees the procession. 30 people, pale, thin, in rags that have been mended so many times that nothing remains of the original. They look at him without hope and without fear. They simply wait patiently for the new king to turn out worse than the last. Ian surveys the crumbling walls, the sagging roof of the tower, skinny horses whose ribs you can count from 10 paces away. And suddenly he realizes he's seen this before. Not here, in a past life. A cheese factory in Vermont where the owner wept over spoiled goat cheese. A brewery in Oregon with equipment older than the owner. He saved places like that, twice, 3 times. He knows where to start. The gray-haired butler, Bjorn, approaches him. Straight back, eyes with enough weariness for 3 people. 32 years of service, 3 kings, each worse than the last. Bjorn opens his mouth to speak of the coronation protocol and the oath. Ian extends his hand to him. Bjorn stops mid-sentence. No king has ever extended a hand to the steward. Ian asks one thing. How much grain is left for the winter? In weeks. Bjorn blinks, then again. 7 weeks, strictly speaking. 8 if we cut the guards' rations. Salt. There's been no salt for 2 years. The last caravan never made it. Cellars. In the cellars, 200 barrels of sour ale, and Bjorn, in tears, begs to be allowed to pour out this disgrace. And this is where the strangest part begins. Ian goes to the cellar first thing. Before the coronation, before the oath, before anything else. He descends the wet steps into the cold and sourness, opens the first barrel, sniffs, scoops up a ladleful, tastes it, holds it on his tongue for 3 seconds, swallows, tastes from the second, from the third, from the 5th. Bjorn watches silently as the new king of Holmgard guzzles slop barrel after barrel like a taster at a fair. Ian straightens up and wipes his mouth. He recognizes this taste. Lactic acid fermentation has taken over the main fermentation. The vinegar hasn't reached the bottom yet. The sugar, this isn't trash, it's a batch. Decanted into the discarded oak barrels that held resin, the ones they've written off and tossed in the far corner. Pour in 3 ladles of honey from the northern apiaries. Seal them tight. Leave them alone for 6 weeks. Bjorn looks at him like he's crazy and asks why he's pouring honey into the slop. Ian answers quietly. He knows how it looks. Instead of a crown, the new king sniffs the sour ale. But he asks for 6 weeks. If it turns out undrinkable, he himself will get down on his knees and apologize to everyone in the castle. Bjorn is silent for a long time. Then he nods. Then he orders the servants to transfer the ale into oak barrels. The sun is already setting overhead, and the castle looks even more menacing in the crimson light. Ian stands in the courtyard and does the math. 7 weeks' worth of grain, 0 salt, 200 barrels of hope in 6 weeks, 30 guards in rags, 12,000 starving subjects outside the walls, and a wedding in 9 days to a princess whom the entire continent calls a curse. He goes to the kitchen. He finds the cook, Martha, with red hands and the look of someone who doesn't give a damn who's on the throne, because the cabbage isn't going to chop itself. Turnips for dinner, bread, that's it. There's thyme, wild garlic, a little lard. Ian rolls up his sleeves and stands at the table next to her. Martha says a king doesn't belong in the kitchen. Ian replies that this one does. He cuts the turnips into thin slices, rubs them with garlic, lays them in layers in a pot, spreads melted fat with thyme over each layer, shoves it in the oven. An hour later, the castle smells, so the guards take turns peeking into the kitchen. Bjorn is the last to arrive. He takes a bite, chews slowly, sets down his spoon, stares intently and says nothing. But this evening, for the first time in 3 years, he serves the king dinner not with an apology, but with curiosity. Ian eats alongside the guards at the common table. No king of Holmgard has ever done that either. Across from him sits the captain of the guard, a redhead, tall, a scar across her eyebrow, Haley O'Brien. She eats in silence and looks at him as if he were a puppy who has yet to soil the carpet. Ian catches her gaze and nods. She does not nod back. She finishes her meal down to the last bite and leaves. But Bjorn notices that for the first time in 6 months, she hasn't left a single crumb. That night, Ian lies on the damp royal bed and stares at the ceiling. A foreign body, a foreign world, foreign memories. 9 days until his wedding to a girl whom an entire continent considers a curse. He closes his eyes. Tomorrow, inspect all the storerooms, take inventory, find a blacksmith, check the water, make a list. He always starts with a list. Lists save the farms, maybe they'll save the kingdom too. The next morning, Ian rose before dawn and began his rounds. He walked through the castle like an inspector on a factory floor, methodically, room by room, pantry by pantry. In the first pantry, he found sacks of grain. He counted them. 23 sacks of rye, 14 sacks of barley, 9 sacks of oats. Bjorn followed him with a lantern and dictated the numbers to the scribe. The scribe was a boy of about 16 with big ears and handwriting that looked as if a chicken had been running across the parchment. His name was Oscar. In the second storeroom, Ian found barrels of salted meat. He opened one. He sniffed it. The meat was on the verge of spoiling. Another week, and it would start to rot. He asked Bjorn how much salt had been used for curing. Bjorn said not much, because there was no salt. So the meat was kept in a brine of ash and vinegar. Ian nodded. The ash brine created an alkaline environment. This slowed down the rotting but spoiled the taste and didn't kill all the bacteria. He needed salt, no question about it. In the third storeroom stood jugs of milk. Ian opened one. He sniffed it. The milk was fine, rich even. He asked where it came from. Bjorn replied that they kept cows in 3 villages to the north, about 40 head in all. They brought the milk every 3 days. Half of it soured on the way. Ian asked what they did with the sour milk. Bjorn replied that they poured it out. Ian stopped. He turned to Bjorn. He said that from that day on, not a single drop of sour milk was to be poured out. All the sour milk was to be collected in separate clay pots and placed in the coldest corner of the cellar. Bjorn asked why. Ian replied that he would show him soon. After the storerooms, Ian went to the villages. He took Bjorn and 2 guards with him. The first village was called Stenholm, 18 households, half of them empty. The people who remained were those who had nowhere else to go, old people, widows with children. A blacksmith without a left hand. The blacksmith's name was Torvald. He had lost his arm in a cave-in at an old mine 5 years ago, and had been forging with one hand ever since, slowly. But he forged. Ian looked at his work. Horseshoes, rough but sturdy. He asked if he had oak charcoal. Torvald said he only had birch. Ian nodded. Birch burned hotter but faster. For what he had in mind, he needed oak. Slow, steady. He made a mental note. In the second village, he found a shepherd who kept 12 goats. The goats were skinny but lively. They gave little milk, but they gave some. Ian tasted the goat's milk. Thick, with a nutty aftertaste. The grass on the northern pastures was sparse but rich in wild thyme, and its oil seeped into the milk. That was good. It was very good. Goat's milk with a hint of thyme is the basis for cheese that can be sold for triple the price, if you know how. Ian knew. He spent the whole day in the villages. By evening, he had a full list. 41 cows, 12 goats, 7 pigs. Not a single sheep. 5 apiaries on the northern slope. The honey is dark and thick with a mountain flavor. 4 streams with clear water. 1 abandoned mine but with an intact shaft. A birch forest to the west. An oak grove to the southeast. Small, but enough to burn for charcoal. Clay along the riverbank. Good clay. Dense. Suitable for pots and molds. Wild herbs on the slopes. Thyme, wormwood, mountain mint, juniper. He returned to the castle by nightfall. He laid out all the information before Bjorn on the kitchen table. Bjorn sat across from him and listened. Ian spoke slowly. He said that Holmgard had no army, no magic, no allies. But Holmgard had something no other kingdom had: a cold climate, clean water, mountain herbs, and time. Bjorn asked what he meant. Ian explained. Fermentation is a process that works better in the cold, slower but better. Cheese aged at low temperatures is denser and more aromatic. Ale fermented in the cold is cleaner and deeper in flavor. Meat cured in the cold wind keeps for months. What the entire continent considered Holmgard's curse. Cold, poverty, isolation. That was the main advantage. Bjorn was silent. Then he said it sounded like the ramblings of a madman. Ian replied that he'd heard it before. From a farmer in Oregon who had 12 goats and a debt of 40,000. Bjorn didn't understand a word of it, but for some reason, he nodded. On the third day, Ian went down to the cellar to the barrels of ale. The barrels were already oak. Honey had been added. The lids were sealed. He checked the temperature with his hand. Cold, 8 degrees. Perfect for slow secondary fermentation. He tapped the side of the barrel. The sound was dull and full. A good sign. In 6 weeks there would be Flemish red ale in here. Or something so close to it that the difference wouldn't matter. If it works out. If the temperature doesn't spike. If the honey was fresh enough. If the oak resin on the barrel walls imparts the right tannins. A lot of ifs. But Ian was used to working with probabilities. In his past life, every batch of cheese was a series of ifs. If the milk had the right acidity. If the starter culture hadn't died. If the temperature hadn't fluctuated at night. If he'd turned the molds over in time. The skill wasn't in eliminating all the ifs. It was in knowing which ones were critical. He went upstairs and headed to the pantry. The sour milk was sitting in pots just as he'd ordered. 3 pots. He opened the first one. He sniffed it. The acidity was high, but not vinegary. The lactic acid bacteria were working properly. The whey had already begun to separate. He asked Martha to bring a clean cloth, a linen one, thick. Martha brought it and stood nearby. Ian strained the milk through the cloth. The curd remained on the cloth, thick, white, with a slightly sour smell. He salted it. With the leftover salt he found at the bottom of an old barrel in the far corner of the pantry. There wasn't much salt, 300 grams. He used half. He kneaded the curd with his hands. He added finely chopped wild garlic. He placed it in a clay mold. He pressed it down with a stone. He put it in the cold. Martha watched this with the expression of a woman who had seen everything in the kitchen but nothing like this before. She asked what it would be. Ian said that in 3 days it would be soft garlic cheese. If she liked it, he'd teach her how to make it every day. Martha grunted and left. But that evening, Ian noticed that she had placed another pot of sour milk next to his mold, just in case. On the 4th day, a messenger arrived from Valzern, a young rider in a red cloak with an embroidered coat of arms, a golden lyre on a scarlet field, the symbol of resonance. The messenger handed over a letter with 3 seals. Ian read it in Bjorn's presence. The letter stated that Princess Solveig, the 4th daughter of King Valzern, would arrive in Holmgard in 5 days for the wedding. This was followed by a list of conditions. Holmgard undertakes to receive the princess with due honors. Holmgard undertakes not to return the princess under any circumstances. Holmgard undertakes not to appeal to the Church of Resonance with complaints about the bride's curse. In the event of a refusal to marry, Valzern reserves the right to military compensation for damages. Ian reread the last clause twice. Military compensation for damages. Valzern has an army of 100,000. Holmgard has 30 guards in chainmail cloaks. This was no proposal. It was a disposal. Bjorn stood pale and silent. Ian folded the letter. He looked at the messenger. He asked one thing. What kind of cheese does the princess like? The messenger didn't understand the question. He repeated it. Ian asked what kind of food Princess Solveig prefers. The messenger hesitated. Then he said that the princess was served simple food, bread and water mostly. In the monastery resonator where she had lived for the past 7 years, the food was meager. Ian nodded. He dismissed the messenger. He turned to Bjorn and said that they needed to prepare a room for the princess, a warm one, with a working fireplace, with a soft bed, with blankets. Bjorn said that the best room in the castle leaks when it rains. Ian said that meant they had to fix the roof first. For 5 days, Ian worked like a dog. He repaired the roof of the best room with the help of 2 guards and a piece of oiled leather. Not perfect, but the rain won't get in. He found some old woolen blankets in the storeroom. He washed them in hot water with ash. He dried them in the wind. They smelled fresh and just a little bit of smoke. I laid them on the bed in 3 layers. I loaded the fireplace with birch logs, dry ones, resin-free, so they'd burn evenly and not smoke. I placed a clay pot of dried mint on the windowsill, just for the scent. Bjorn watched all this in silence. On the 3rd day of preparations, he asked why all this trouble for a cursed woman who'd been banished like trash. Ian paused. He looked at Bjorn. He said that no one would be called trash in his castle, not now nor ever. Bjorn hunched his shoulders. He nodded. He didn't ask any more questions. The soft cheese was ready on the fourth day. Ian took it out of the mold, white, firm on the outside and creamy on the inside, with the scent of wild garlic and a slightly sour note. He cut off a piece and gave it to Martha. Martha chewed slowly. She stopped. She looked at the cheese, then at Ian. She said she'd been in the kitchen for 40 years and had never eaten anything like it. Ian cut a piece for Bjorn. Bjorn tasted it. He had bad teeth and always ate carefully. This cheese was soft enough not to cause him pain. Bjorn chewed and said nothing. Then he swallowed and quietly said it was delicious. Just delicious. Ian cut off a third piece and wrapped it in a clean cloth. He put it away in the storeroom. This piece was for Solveig. On the morning of the fifth day, Haley came to Ian with a report. 27 guards on duty, 3 on sick leave. Weapons in acceptable condition. The castle walls will withstand a storm, but not a siege. The gate is hanging by a single hinge. Ian asked if Torvald Orvald forge a new hinge. Haley replied that Torvald was one-handed. Ian said he knew. Could Torvald do it? Haley paused and said he could, if given time. Ian said they had time. The hinge isn't needed for the wedding, it's for winter. Haley looked at him more intently than usual. Then she asked directly. She asked if he was afraid. Ian asked of what exactly? Haley said of the cursed wife. Everyone is afraid. Her previous fiancé ran away from the altar to a neighboring kingdom and took monastic vows just to avoid touching her. Ian thought for a second. Then he said he was afraid that the grain would last 7 weeks, but winter lasts 20. The curse ranks somewhere 12th on his list of problems, after the leaky roof and the lack of salt. Haley snorted. But the corner of her mouth twitched. It was almost a smile. She went to check the outposts. Ian noticed that she was walking a little more steadily than usual, like someone who had heard something unexpected and was processing it. That evening, a convoy appeared on the horizon. 4 covered wagons, 10 horsemen in red cloaks of Alzern. No banners, no trumpets, no honor guard. As if they were transporting not a princess, but cargo best kept under wraps. Ian stood at the gate, Bjorn beside him. Behind them, 10 guards in the cleanest cloaks they could find. Haley stood slightly to the side, a sword at her belt. The first wagon stopped, a Valsernian with the face of a man carrying out an unpleasant errand. He handed Ian a scroll and said that the princess had been delivered. Delivered. Like a commodity. Ian took the scroll but didn't read it. He looked at the second wagon. The curtain fell back. And he saw her. Solveig was small, smaller than he had expected. Silver hair down to her waist, slender arms, pale skin, almost transparent. A simple gray dress, a nun's habit. She stood on the step of the carriage and did not move. Her eyes were downcast, her shoulders were slumped. She stood like a person waiting for a blow, always waiting for a blow, since birth. The Valsern officer began saying something about the formalities of the handover. Ian wasn't listening. He walked up to the wagon. He held out his hand. Solveig flinched, not from the cold, from the fact that a hand was held out to her rather than an order to get out. She looked up. Gray eyes, huge, full of that cautious terror that animals raised in a cage feel when the door is suddenly opened. Ian said her room was ready, warm, with a fireplace. If she was hungry, there was hot soup and fresh bread in the kitchen. Solveig stared at him without blinking. Then she quietly placed her hand in his. Her fingers were icy. He led her to the room. She stepped inside and stopped at the threshold. She looked at the bed with 3 blankets, at the fireplace with a fire, at the pot of mint on the windowsill. She turned to him, opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She asked in a quiet voice that held nothing but confusion. She asked if this was for her. Ian said yes. Solveig stood there for another 3 seconds. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and placed her hands on her knees. Her fingers were trembling. She said she'd been told that Holmgard was a punishment, that the castle was in ruins, that the new king was a savage from the mountains. Ian replied that the castle was indeed not in the best condition, and that he was indeed not the most refined of men, but that it would not be a punishment. If he could promise that at least.
not a punishment. Solveig said nothing, but her fingers stopped trembling. Ian left her alone. He closed the door quietly. Bjorn was standing in the hallway. He had heard everything. He said nothing. But when Ian walked past, Bjorn bowed slightly to him for the first time in all these days. Not formally, genuinely. The wedding was in 4 days. Ian spent them preparing the little he could. He slaughtered 1 pig out of 7. It was painful. Every animal counted. But there had to be a wedding feast. Let it be modest. Let it be turnips and pork and bread. But there had to be one. Martha helped. She no longer asked why. She simply did what he asked and sometimes nodded when the result turned out well.
Ian showed her how to smoke the meat, without expensive beechwood chips, on birch sawdust with juniper berries added, slowly, over cold smoke, 10 hours. Martha grumbled that it was too long. After 10 hours, she fell silent. The meat was dark gold and smelled of the forest and smoke and something sweet from the berries. She cut off a thin slice, put it in her mouth, closed her eyes. Ian had seen that expression before, on farmers who were tasting their own product for the first time, made just right. Surprise, then quiet pride, then a question in her eyes. Did I really make this? Martha opened her eyes. She said she was 62 years old, and that for the first time she understood why she stood at the stove at all. The wedding took place on the 9th day after Ian's arrival in Holmgard. The ceremony was short. The priest was local, an old man. He stuttered with nervousness. There were no guests except their own. 30 guards. Bjorn, Martha, Oscar the scribe. Torvald the blacksmith came from the village. Solveig stood next to Ian in the same gray dress because she had no other. She didn't look up. When the priest asked if she consented, she nodded so quietly that he had to ask again. She nodded again. Ian said yes, loudly and calmly, like a man signing a contract he believes in. After the ceremony there was a feast. Turnips baked with thyme and lard, smoked pork over birchwood, soft cheese with wild garlic, fresh bread, honey, water from a mountain stream. Not much, but everything was real and delicious and made with care. The guards ate in silence and with concentration. Bjorn cried over the smoked pork and pretended it was from the smoke. Haley ate 3 servings of cheese. Solveig ate little, in small bites, like someone who's used to having food taken away. Ian placed before her that very piece of cheese he'd wrapped up for her 3 days ago. Solveig tasted it, chewed slowly, stopped, looked at the cheese, then at Ian. She said nothing, but she finished the whole piece, down to the last crumb. At night, their wedding night, Solveig stood by the bed with the face of a person walking to their execution. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her fingers were white with tension. Ian took 2 blankets out of the chest. He put one on the bed. He threw the second one on the floor. He said she would sleep on the bed, he on the floor. Solveig didn't understand. He repeated himself. He said he would sleep on the floor, she on the bed. If she needed anything during the night, she should wake him up. Solveig stood there, motionless. Then she quietly asked why. Ian thought for a moment. Then he said simply, because she's tired from the journey and needs to get some sleep. And the floor isn't new to him. He made tea, mint with honey, hot, in a clay mug. He set it on the bedside table. Solveig sat down on the bed. She took the mug, warmed her hands, drank in small sips. Ian lay down on the floor, wrapped in a blanket. He closed his eyes. 5 minutes later, he heard a soft sound. Solveig was crying, silently. Only her breath was ragged. He didn't get up, didn't ask what was wrong. He knew that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to let them cry without interrupting. In the morning, he woke up to a smell. Strange, sweetish, warm, like caramel but not quite. He got up. Solveig was still asleep, curled up under 3 blankets. Only her silver hair was visible on the pillow. He quietly left the room and went down to the pantry, and froze. The milk in the jugs had changed. Yesterday it had been ordinary, white and runny. Now it was thick, almost like cream, and it smelled sweetish, as if someone had added honey and vanilla to it. But no one had. Ian scooped some up with a spoon. He tasted it. The flavor was incredible, rich and complex. as if the milk had lived a whole lifetime in a single night. The proteins had broken down differently. The fats had rearranged themselves. The lactose had partially turned into something resembling maltose. He stood there with the spoon in his hand, thinking. Then he remembered. The letter from Walzern. The bride's curse. Everything she touches withers and spoils. That's what they wrote. But the milk hadn't spoiled. It had gotten better. Much better. He looked at the ceiling. Solveig was sleeping right above him on the second floor. Her curse worked at night. Every night. It changed something around her. And for all 17 years, they'd told her she was poisoning the world. But she was making it taste better. For 3 days, Ian hadn't slept properly. He would lie down on the bedroom floor next to Solveig and stay awake until dawn. He would go to the pantry. He would check. Every morning, something had changed. On the first night, it was the milk. Thick, slightly sweet. On the second night, the dried herbs in the pantry across the wall from the bedroom changed. The mint that had been sitting there for 6 months and had almost lost its scent suddenly smelled as if it had just been picked. The thyme became sharper. The mountain wormwood acquired a honeyed note it had never had before. On the third night, Ian found something else, the rusty lock on the cellar door, the one that hadn't opened in months. It was covered with a thin, bluish film. Ian touched it, smooth, cold, hard. He tried to scratch it with his fingernail, to no avail. He tried a key. The key left a white streak on the lock like chalk on a blackboard. The lock wasn't scratched. Ian sat on the step and thought for a whole hour. Milk, herbs, metal. 3 completely different materials, 3 completely different changes, but one pattern. Every change made the material better. It didn't spoil it, it didn't destroy it, it improved it. The milk became richer, the herbs more fragrant, the metal harder, the radius of effect. He calculated it in his head. The bedroom on the second floor, the pantry with the milk right below it. The pantry with the herbs through the wall. The lock on the cellar door 1 floor below and 10 steps to the side. A radius of about 15 meters, maybe 20. It works at night. From sunset to sunrise. Every night. On everything within the radius. It's not a curse. It's a catalyst. A biochemical catalyst of incredible power that accelerates and optimizes natural processes in any organic and inorganic material. For 17 years, the Church of Valzerna taught Solveig that she was poisoning the world. And she was perfecting it. Every night. In her sleep. Ian got up and went upstairs. Solveig was already awake. She was sitting on the bed, hunching over as always, with her eyes downcast as always. She said she'd heard him walking around at night. She asked if something bad had happened. Bad. She was always expecting the worst. Ian sat down next to her, not close, at arm's length. He said nothing bad had happened. He said he wanted to show her something. She stood up and followed him. To the pantry. He opened the milk jug. He gave her a spoon. She tasted it, her eyes widened. She knew what the milk had been like yesterday. Ordinary. Now it was different. She put down the spoon. She took a step back. Her face grew even paler. She said it was her. It was her curse. She had spoiled the milk. Ian shook his head. He told her to try it again, carefully. Solveig looked at him in horror. But she tried, slowly. She held it on her tongue. Ian asked if the milk had gotten worse or better. Solveig was silent. Then she said quietly that it was better. Her voice trembled. Ian nodded. He led her to the herbs. She sniffed the mint. She sniffed the thyme. She flinched every time. Every time she waited for him to say it was awful. He didn't say anything. He said the mint smelled fresher than the kind he bought in Portland for $12 a bunch. Solveig didn't know what Portland was, or what $1 was, but from the tone of voice, she understood. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't angry, he was interested. Like a craftsman who had found a tool he hadn't even dreamed of. He led her to the lock on the cellar door. He pointed out the bluish patina. He explained that this metal was now harder than anything in the castle. Solveig stood and listened. Then she asked quietly. She asked if he wasn't afraid that she would change him too. At night, while he sleeps beside her. Ian thought. Then he said that if she did to him what she did to the milk, he'd be only too happy. It would become thicker and sweeter. Solveig didn't laugh. But something in her face changed. The muscle at the corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile. A shadow of a smile. The first in 17 years. Ian began to think. To calculate. To plan. If her ability worked on milk, then the cheese dairy had to be right beneath her bedroom. Every night the milk would transform. In the morning he would be working with a material that could not be obtained by any other means. Cheese made from this milk would be unlike anything else. But he couldn't just take her and use her. He couldn't walk up to her and say she was a valuable resource. It would be the truth, but it would kill her. She had been a thing her whole life. In the convent, she was a problem they had isolated. In marriage, she was a punishment that had been imposed. If he turned her into a tool, she would remain an object, just a useful object instead of a harmful one. That's not salvation, it's another cage. Ian went down to the basement and found a room that could become a cheese-making room. Stone walls, a cold floor, the ceiling right below the bedroom. The temperature was 8 or 9 degrees, stable, perfect. He asked Bjorn to find 4 vats, clay ones, big ones, and wooden shelves, and clean cloth, linen, plenty of it. Bjorn asked why. Ian said he was going to teach the princess how to make cheese. Bjorn opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said that a princess of royal blood shouldn't be standing in the cellar up to her elbows in curd. Ian replied that this princess had spent 7 years in a convent up to her elbows in ashes and prayers. The cellar and the curd would be an improvement. Bjorn wanted to object. He looked Ian in the eyes. He didn't. He went to look for the vats. The next day, Ian brought Solveig to the cellar. She stood at the entrance, hesitating to enter. He lit 4 candles. He placed them in the corners. The cellar became warm and soft in the candlelight. The stone no longer looked gloomy. Ian set a jug of transformed milk before her. He said that now he show her something, and that he needed her help. Not her curse, her hands. Solveig looked at him warily. He began slowly. He explained that milk could be turned into cheese, that to do this the milk had to be allowed to sour in a certain way. Then separate the whey, then form a curd, then add salt, then wait. He spoke simply, without technical terms, just as he had explained to the farm wives in Oregon when he taught them how to work with goat's milk. He demonstrated with his glim. This is how we pour it, this is how we stir it, this is how we strain it. Solveig listened, at first tensely, then attentively. Then her hands reached out on their own toward the cloth through which he was straining the milk. She asked if she could do it. Ian stepped back. She took the cloth. Her hands trembled just a little, but they held it firmly. The curd remained on the cloth, white, pure. She looked at it and said quietly that it was beautiful. Ian nodded. He said yes, beautiful. They worked for 2 hours. Ian demonstrated. Solveig repeated. By the end, they had 3 containers of soft cheese. Ian added dried mint to one, wild garlic to another. He left the third plain. He put all 3 in the fridge. He said that in 3 days they'd see how it turned out. Solveig stood at the table and looked at her hands, hands that touched the milk and made something out of it. Didn't spoil it, didn't poison it, made it. She looked up at Ian. She said that before, she wasn't allowed to touch food. At the convent, they fed her through a grate, as if she were contagious. Ian didn't say anything in that, but when they left the basement, he noticed she was walking a little straighter. Her shoulders were slightly more upright, just a tiny bit, like a flower that had found a small ray of light in a dark room. That evening, Bjorn approached Ian, quietly, with no witnesses. He asked what he was doing with the princess. Ian replied that he was teaching her a craft. Bjorn asked why. Ian looked him in the eye and told the truth. He said that Solveig has an ability that the whole world considers a curse. But it's not a curse, it's a gift. And if she learns to work with it herself, with her own hands, she'll stop being afraid of herself. And on that day, Holmgard will change forever. Bjorn was silent for a long time. Then he asked how Ian knew all this. About milk, about cheese, about fermentation, about how the curse works. Ian thought for a moment. Then he said it was a long story, and that he would tell it someday. But not today. Bjorn nodded. He was used to kings lying. But this one wasn't lying. He just didn't tell the whole story. For Bjorn, that was a huge difference. 6 weeks passed faster than Ian expected. Every day was scheduled down to the hour. Mornings in the cheese dairy with Solveig. Afternoons visiting villages or working in the storerooms. Evenings doing the accounts with Bjorn. Nights sleeping on the floor in the bedroom while Solveig slept in the bed, and her gift transformed everything around her. The cheese dairy began operations on the 3rd day after the wedding. 4 clay vats, wooden shelves, linen cloth for straining, molds made of river clay that Ian had sculpted himself and fired in Martha's kiln. Every morning he went down to the cellar and fetched the milk that had stood within Solveig's radius of influence all night. The milk was impossible, thick as liquid cream. with a sweetish aftertaste and a complex aroma that changed from night to night. Sometimes nutty, sometimes honeyed, sometimes with a subtle floral note that Ian had never encountered in any milk in any world. Solveig came every morning, at first timidly. She stood at the entrance and waited for an invitation. After a week, she began to come in on her own. After 2 weeks, she had her own place at the table, her own knife for chopping herbs, her own burlap apron that Martha had sewn for her in secret. Ian taught her step by step, how to determine the acidity of the milk by taste, how to sense the moment when the curd is ready, how to salt evenly, how to turn the mold so that they ripen evenly on all sides. Solveig learned quietly and attentively. She didn't ask questions out loud, but Ian saw how she watched his hands, memorized, repeated the motions when he wasn't looking. By the end of the 2nd week, she could already make soft cheese on her own from start to finish. By the end of the 3rd week, she began experimenting. She added dried mountain mint, ground into a powder, to one cheese. In another, she sprinkled juniper berries that had been crushed with the back of a knife. Ian tasted both. The mint one was fresh and light. The juniper one was dark and smoky and strangely reminded him of a goat cheese from a farm in Tuscany he'd visited once at a conference. He looked at Solveig. She stood there waiting for his reaction, her hands clasped in front of her, out of habit, ready to hear that it was all bad. Ian said the juniper one was magnificent. Solveig blinked. He repeated himself. He said it was the best young cheese he'd tasted he almost said in 10 years of work. He corrected himself. He said in a very long time. Solveig stood motionless for about 5 seconds. Then the corners of her lips twitched, barely noticeably. She said quietly that she'd make some more then. That was the turning point. Small, quiet, but Ian felt it. She said, "I'll make some more." She didn't ask for permission. She didn't apologize for taking the initiative. She just said, "I'll make some more." That same evening, Haley caught Ian in the hallway. She said the guards were whispering. They say the new king takes the cursed princess to the cellar every morning, that she's casting spells on the milk, that soon all the milk in the castle will turn to poison. Ian asked who exactly was whispering. Haley named 2. Young men, locals, superstitious. Ian asked her to bring them to him, in the morning. Haley brought them, 2 guys, around 20, scared. Ian didn't scold them, didn't order them to be quiet. He took them to the cellar. He took out a piece of cheese, 3 days old, soft, with wild garlic. He cut it, gave each of them a piece, said the princess had made it, with her own hands. The guys looked at the cheese as if it were a bomb. Then one of them took the plunge, took a bite, chewed carefully, swallowed, waited, didn't die, took another bite. The second followed suit. A minute later, both had finished their pieces and were looking at Ian with the expression of people who'd just been told the earth is round. Ian said that milk touched by the princess doesn't turn into poison. It becomes the best milk in the kingdom, and that anyone who wants to can try it any time. The lads left in silence. By evening, the rumor about the cheese had spread through the castle faster than the rumor about the curse. The 6th week began on a cold morning. Ian woke up earlier than usual. He lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling. Today was barrel day. 6 weeks ago, he had ordered the sour ale to be transferred into oak barrels with honey. Today, he would open them. If he had been wrong, if the temperature had fluctuated, if the honey was too old, if the oak resin had produced the wrong tannin, then there would be vinegar in the barrels, and he would lose that fragile trust he had been building bit by bit every day. He got dressed and went downstairs. Bjorn was already standing in the cellar. The old steward had arrived before the king. He stood by the barrels and looked at them the way a father looks at a child brought in from the forest, with hope and fear at the same time. Ian approached the first barrel. He tapped it. The sound was full and deep. Good. He took out a wooden tap, inserted it into the hole at the bottom of the barrel, turned it. It poured out. Thick, dark, the color of dark amber with a ruby sheen. Ian held out a mug, brought it to his nose. The aroma was powerful and complex. Honey, oak, a hint of tartness, a smoky note from the resin, and something else, something warm and deep that isn't found in ordinary ale. These barrels had been in the cellar, within Solveig's range, 6 weeks, every night. She hadn't just accelerated the fermentation, she had transformed it, added notes that no brewer in the world could ever achieve. Ian took a sip, closed his eyes. Flemish red, but not quite, deeper, more complex, with a honeyed body and a smoky aftertaste that lasted 10 seconds. And the final note, floral, delicate, like a ghost of a scent you catch and can't quite grasp. He opened his eyes. Bjorn was standing there waiting. Ian handed him the mug. Bjorn took it, brought it to his lips, took a sip, stopped, took a second, a third, set the mug down, stood silently for 10 seconds, then turned to Ian, and Ian saw that the butler's eyes were wet. Bjorn said he'd been drinking ale for 30 years, under 3 kings, but he'd never tasted anything like this. Ian nodded. He asked for Haley to be summoned. Haley arrived 5 minutes later. She tasted it. She was silent for about 5 seconds. Then she said one word. Strong, but approving. Ian asked Bjorn to select the 20 best barrels, seal them, label them. This would be the first batch for sale. He would leave the remaining 180 barrels to age. Each passing week would only make the ale better. He asked Bjorn if he knew any merchants who traded with the southern kingdoms. Bjorn said he knew one, or rather he remembered one. A merchant named Ragnar Holm, an old acquaintance from the previous king's time. He transports furs and timber to the south. Sometimes he stops by Holmgard on the way. Ian told Bjorn to send him a message. He invited him to stop by, for a tasting. For the first time, Bjorn allowed himself something resembling a smile. 3 days later, Ragnar Holm arrived. A heavy-set man with a red beard and the shrewd eyes of someone who sees the value of everything down to the last coin. He came out of politeness and boredom. Ian led him into the cellar. He poured some ale. Ragnar tasted it. He was silent for a full minute. Then he set down his mug and spoke in a completely different voice. Not a polite one, businesslike. He asked how many barrels there were. Ian said 20 were ready for sale. Ragnar asked how much he wanted per barrel. Ian named his price. Ragnar laughed. He said it was robbery. Then he drained his mug, poured himself another. He drank it. He named his price. It was half as much. Ian shook his head. Ragnar haggled for 40 minutes. Ian didn't budge. He knew the product's value. He knew there was no ale like this anywhere else. Ragnar knew that too. They agreed on a price that was a quarter higher than the original. For 20 barrels, Ragnar paid a sum equal to the annual tax from 2 villages, in coins, gold, and silver. Bjorn counted them 3 times because he couldn't believe his eyes. Ragnar left with a wagon load of barrels and a promise to return in a month for the next shipment. Ian stood at the gate and watched the wagon drive away down the road to the south. Behind him stood Bjorn. Next to Bjorn stood Haley, and Ian felt that they were standing a little closer than before. Not like subjects behind a king. Like people behind a man they were beginning to trust. That evening he went to the cheese dairy. Solveig was there, alone, turning the cheese molds. Without being told, without an order. She had simply come and was doing her work. Ian stopped in the doorway and watched. She moved calmly, confidently. Her hands didn't tremble. Her burlap apron was tied in a neat knot. Her silver hair was pulled back into a braid so it wouldn't get in the way. She looked up. She saw him. She didn't flinch. For the first time in all these weeks, she didn't flinch when someone walked in. She said she'd made 6 new molds, 2 with mint, 2 with juniper. And she'd tried 2 with honey and thyme. Ian walked over. He looked. The molds were even. The salt was distributed evenly. The herbs were mixed in correctly. He said it looked great. Solveig nodded. And then he noticed. She was standing up straight, not slouching, shoulders back, chin not pressed against her chest. She was looking at her cheese molds with an expression Ian had seen hundreds of times at farmers' markets. The quiet pride of a craftsman in their work. She didn't know what that feeling was yet. She didn't know how to name it yet. But it was already inside her. Small, fragile, like a sprout that had broken through a rock. Ian turned away so she wouldn't see his face. Because if she saw it, she would ask why the king's eyes were wet. And he wasn't ready to explain that he was crying out of pride for a girl who, 3 weeks ago, didn't believe she had the right to touch food. Solveig had learned to make cheese on her own and had begun experimenting with additives. Ian had quelled the rumors among the guards by letting them taste the cheese. The barrels of ale were opened 6 weeks later and turned out to be magnificent. Merchant Ragnar Holm bought the first batch of 20 barrels for a sum equal to the annual tax of 2 villages.
It's important to remember that the ale gained extra depth from Solveig's gift working on it overnight. Ragnar promised to return in a month. Solveig is working on her own for the first time and has stopped slouching. The money from Ragnar changed everything, not because there was a lot of it, but because it was the first. Ian sat down at the table with Bjorn and divided the coins into 3 piles. The first for salt, the second for tools, the third for seeds. Bjorn asked where to get salt if the southern pass has been closed for 2 years. Ian said the pass isn't closed, it's forgotten. There's a huge difference. No one has set up a guard post there. It's just that the caravans stopped coming because Holmgard had nothing to offer in exchange. Now they do.
He'll send a wagon train with ale south through the pass and return with salt. Bjorn said it was dangerous. The road through the pass is in ruins, bandits, wolves. Ian asked Haley how many guards she could spare to protect the wagon train. Haley said 4, no more. The castle would be left unguarded. Ian nodded. 4 it is then. He selected 10 barrels of ale from the 180 that were maturing in the cellar. He loaded them onto 2 carts. He added 20 wheels of cheese, soft garlic cheese, and juniper cheese. He wrapped each wheel in a clean cloth. The convoy set off at dawn. Haley volunteered to lead the guard herself. Ian didn't argue. He could see she needed this, not to sit in the castle, but to do something real. She rode ahead of the convoy with a sword at her belt and the look of someone who'd finally been given a task worthy of her. While the wagon train headed south, Ian set to work on his second project, smoked meat. Martha had already mastered cold smoking over birch sawdust with juniper. But there wasn't much meat. 7 pigs, minus 1 for the wedding feast. 6. It was too early to slaughter another one. But there were fish in the river behind the castle. Trout, small but fatty. The guards sometimes caught them for themselves, but never many. Ian asked Torvald to forge 10 fishing hooks. Torvald made them in 2 days, with one hand. The hooks were rough but sturdy. Ian organized the fishing. 5 guards took turns, every day. The catch went to the kitchen. Martha gutted and cleaned them. Ian showed her how to salt the fish in wooden boxes, sprinkling them with leftover salt and dried herbs. There was little salt, critically little. He stretched every gram, added ash, added vinegar, used every trick he knew from his past life. The fish that wasn't salted was smoked. Thin slices of trout hung over birch smoke in a small smokehouse that Ian had built out of stones and old planks behind the shed. 12 hours of cold smoke. The result was golden and translucent as amber. Martha tasted the first piece and said it wasn't. Oh, it's something else. Something people will pay money for. Ian nodded. He knew. Smoked trout with mountain herbs. In his past life, they sold this at Seattle's Pike Place Market for $20 a pound. Here, it would cost no less. 3 weeks after the wagon train left, Ian did what he'd feared most. He went to Solveig and suggested she leave the castle. She hadn't gone out once since arriving. The kitchen, the cheese dairy, the bedroom, that was her whole world. Ian said he wanted to show her the apiaries on the north slope. Solveig turned pale. She said people would be watching. Ian replied that people watch everyone. That's what people do. Solveig said they would be afraid. Ian said they were afraid of winter, of hunger, wolves. A girl with silver hair wasn't the scariest thing they'd ever seen. Solveig was silent for a minute. Then she nodded. They set out in the morning. Ian walked beside her. Not ahead, not behind, beside her. The walk to the apiaries took an hour. On the way, they met 3 peasants from Stenholm, an old man and 2 women. They stopped and stared at Solveig. She flinched. Ian greeted them calmly. He asked how the turnip harvest was going. The old man replied that it was poor. The ground was cold. Ian nodded and walked on. Solveig followed him, breathing as if she'd just run a mile. But she kept walking. The apiaries were on a sunny slope among heather and wild thyme. 5 hives, old ones, made of woven twigs coated with clay. The beekeeper was an old man named Gunnar, 70 years old, deaf in one ear. His hands were stained with propolis. He bowed to Ian and glanced at Solveig warily. Ian asked to see the honey. Gunnar opened one hive. The honey was dark, almost black, thick as tar. Ian tasted it, bitter, with a strong aftertaste of thyme and heather, and a long aftertaste in which he detected a hint of smoke. Mountain honey. Northern honey. You can't get this anywhere except in places with cold, short summers and poor, rocky soil. The bees gathered nectar from the herbs growing on the cliffs. Not much nectar, but concentrated, rich in essential oils. Honey made from such nectar was 10 times more fragrant than ordinary honey. Ian turned to Solveig and held out a spoonful of honey to her. She tasted it. Her eyes widened. Ian said that this honey was worth a fortune, and that they would add it to the cheese, a thin layer between the layers of curd. Let it age for 3 weeks. He could already picture the result in his mind. A semi-hard cheese with veins of dark mountain honey, salty sweet, with the aroma of thyme and heather. Nothing like it existed on this continent. He asked Gunnar how much honey he collected over the summer. Gunnar said, not much, 12 jars. Ian asked if he could set up more hives. Gunnar scratched the back of his head, said there weren't enough bees, the swarms are weak, winter kills half of them. Ian nodded. He thought for a moment. He asked Solveig aloud, what if we put one hive next to her window, within her range? Solveig didn't understand. Ian explained. Her gift improves everything within a 15-meter radius at night. Milk, herbs, metal. What if it improved the bees, too? Made them stronger, healthier, more resistant to the cold? Solveig looked at him, and Ian saw something happening in her eyes. Something complex. All her life she'd heard that her gift killed all living things. And here he was, standing before her, suggesting they place live bees right next to her window. As if those 17 years of fear hadn't existed, as if it were normal. She nodded, quietly. Gunnar agreed to give them one hive. They brought it to the castle that evening. They placed it on a ledge in the wall under the bedroom window. 3 days later, Ian checked the hive. The bees were alive, more than alive. They moved faster, more actively. The combs they built were smoother and denser than usual, and the honey. Ian scooped up a drop. The taste hit him like a slap in the face. Rich, incredibly fragrant. With such depth that he closed his eyes and stood there for 5 seconds, simply sifting through the nuances on his tongue. Thyme, heather, smoke, caramel, something floral and ethereal, the same scent as in the L, the Solveig note. He called her over. She tasted it. She stood in silence. Then she looked up at him and, for the first time ever, said neither a question nor an apology. She said she was the one who'd made it. She didn't ask, she said. Ian nodded. Yes, you did. The wagon train returned in 4 weeks. Haley led it through the gate with an expression of weary victory. 4 wagons had left, 3 returned. 1 was lost on the pass. A wheel broke on the rocks. The barrels were overloaded. But they brought everything back. Salt, 3 barrels. Real sea salt from the south. Cloth, 2 bales. Rough but sturdy. Tools, 2 sets of blacksmith's hammers and tongs for Torvald. Seeds, a sack of a new variety of barley, a sack of turnips, and a sack of something Haley called southern peas. Ian looked at the peas and smiled. They weren't exactly peas, they were beans, similar to lentils, a protein crop that grew quickly and added nitrogen to the soil. He knew what to do with them. Haley gave a brief report. The ale had sold out in a day. Merchants in the southern town of Manhwa were fighting over the barrels. The cheese had sold out in 2 hours. A merchant from Valzern tasted the juniper cheese and offered triple the price for the next batch. Haley fell silent. Then she added that the merchant had asked where such products came from in impoverished Holmgard. She replied that it was a secret of the crown. Ian smirked. A secret of the crown? Sounds good. Bjorn counted the goods that had been brought in. He made an inventory. When he finished, he turned to Ian and said quietly that under the previous 3 kings, Holmgard's treasury had only dwindled. Every year, every month. For the first time in 12 years, it had grown. Ian nodded. He asked if there would be enough grain now. Bjorn calculated. With the new barley and beans, and if the fishing continued at the same pace, yes, there would be enough. Until spring. For the first time in 3 years, Holmgard would survive the winter without famine. Ian closed his eyes for a second. In his past life, he had saved small farms. 12 goats. 40,000 in debt. Here, he was saving 12,000 people. And the scale of it weighed on him. Every day, every night. But today it felt a little easier. A breath easier. Rumors spread faster than wagons. 2 months after the wedding, Holmgard was the talk of every tavern from Marenhall to the capital of Valzern. People said all sorts of things. That the beggar king of the north brews an ale that could raise the dead. That his witch of a wife had cast a spell on the milk, and now they make cheese from it that smells like heaven. That in the castle up north they forge a blue metal that no blade can pierce. Half of it was lies, half of it was truth, but both truth and lies the same thing. They drew people in. The first to arrive was neither a merchant's wife nor a spy. The first to arrive was a girl, skinny, in a tattered cloak, with a knapsack on her back containing nothing but a piece of dry bread and a wooden spoon. The guard stopped her at the gate. Haley brought her to Ian. The girl was 17. Her name was Una Park. She spoke quickly and incoherently. She said she'd been walking for 14 days from a southern port city, that she'd heard from a merchant at the port that there was a king in the north who wasn't afraid of the cursed, that she was cursed, that her touch made plants grow fast. That wasn't true. The cherry tree in her father's garden had bloomed in November, and the neighbors had burned the tree and then come for her. Her father had opened the door and told them he had no daughter. Her mother stood behind him and said nothing. Una ran through the back fence that night. She headed north, because there was nowhere else to go. Ian listened. Haley stood nearby and looked at the girl with an expression Ian couldn't read, something between pity and anger. When Una finished, Ian didn't ask any questions. He didn't check. He didn't doubt. He turned to Martha, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, and told her to feed the girl. Something hot, a lot. Martha nodded and led Una away. Una ate the way people eat who haven't eaten in 3 days. Quickly, greedily, choking. Martha stood nearby and kept serving her. Turnips, bread, smoked fish, a piece of cheese. Una ate everything. Then she looked up at Martha and asked if she could have some more bread. Martha gave her half a loaf. Una ate it slowly, in small bites, as if she wanted to remember every one. The next day, Ian took Una to an old outbuilding behind the kitchen. Stone walls, dirt floor, the roof was intact, sunlight streaming through a narrow window. He said this would be her greenhouse. Una didn't understand. Ian explained. If her touch makes plants grow, then it's not a curse, it's a tool. She needs a place where she can work with it, safe, without fear. He took a key out of his pocket, old, rusty, for this very outbuilding. He handed it to Una, said it was hers. No one would enter without her permission. Una stood and looked at the key, then at Ian, then back at the key. She took it in both hands, pressed it to her chest. Ian saw her chin tremble. She turned and walked away quickly. Martha later said that Una had cried into her pillow all night, but in the morning she was in the greenhouse, from dawn. On the dirt floor stood pots of soil that she had dug. The pots contained bean seeds that Haley had brought from the south. Una placed her palms on the soil and closed her eyes. 10 minutes later, green sprouts appeared from the ground. An hour later, they were as tall as her palm. Ian stood in the doorway and watched. He wasn't surprised. He was intrigued. The growth rate, the direction, the shape of the leaves, everything was normal, just faster. 10 times faster, 20 times, like fast forwarding. But the plant was healthy, not deformed, not sick, just fast. He asked Una if it was tiring her out. Una said yes. After an hour, her head hurt. After 2, her hands started to shake. Ian nodded. So there was a limit. So it wasn't an endless source. It was work, like any other work, and she needed rest. He told Una to work no more than an hour a day. She looked at him in surprise. Before, no one had ever told her when to stop. Before, everyone had told her not to start. Solveig met Una in the castle corridor on the second day. They stood facing each other in silence, 2 cursed ones, one quiet and silver-haired, the other bold and black-haired. Una spoke first. She asked if it was true that Solveig made cheese that made people cry. Solveig didn't know what to say. Una said she wanted to try it. Solveig led her to the cheese cellar. She took out a piece of 3-week-old juniper cheese. She cut off a slice. She handed it to her. Una tasted it. She chewed intently. Then she looked up and said it was the best thing she'd ever eaten in her life. Solveig stood there in silence. But Ian, who was watching from behind the door, saw how she straightened up slightly, how her fingers unclenched, how something warm flashed in her gray eyes. A compliment from a stranger, not from Ian, who was obligated to be kind because he was her husband, from a girl who had come from the road and owed her nothing. This was different. This was real. Una had settled into the castle within a week. She was boisterous, curious. She got into everything. She asked questions nonstop. Why cheese is salted and not sugared? Why ale ferments in the dark and not in the light? Why Haley wears her sword on the left and not the right? Why Bjorn talks to the barrels when he thinks no one is listening. Haley snorted at her. Bjorn grumbled. Martha threatened her with a spoon when Una snatched pieces of cheese from the pantry. But no one chased her away, and Una could feel that. 10 days after Una's arrival, Ian conducted an experiment. He asked Una to grow barley in the greenhouse. Ordinary barley from the seeds they'd brought from the south. Una grew it in 3 days. The ears were full and heavy. Ian harvested the grain. He soaked it. Spread it out in a thin layer on a damp cloth in a warm corner of the kitchen. 2 days later, the grain had sprouted. He dried the sprouted grain, ground it into flour. He added hot water. He stirred it. He waited an hour. He tasted it. Sweet. Maltose. Malt from sprouted barley. The base for real beer. For bread without honey. For a dozen other products that required sugar in a world where sugar cost as much as silver. He stood in the kitchen with a mug of malt syrup in his hand and thought about how those 2 damn girls had just created a production chain that, in his past world, was called vertical integration. Una grows the grain. Solveig refines the raw materials at night. He turns them into a product. Martha cooks. Haley drives it out to sell. Bjorn counts the money. Everyone does what they know how to do. Everyone is needed. No one is superfluous. This wasn't a royal entourage, it was a team. He finished the syrup, sweet, warm, with a nutty aftertaste of sprouted barley. And he thought that for the first time since he'd been in this world, he felt something resembling home. In the 4th month, Ian decided to do what he'd been putting off since day 1. He went down into the abandoned mine east of the castle. Alone, without a guard, with a lantern and a rope. The mine was old. 40 years, maybe 50. The wooden supports had rotted away, but the stone vault held. Ian walked slowly. He checked every step. His engineering instinct told him the rock here was solid, granite with veins of quartz. There hadn't been a cave-in a long time. The air was moving. That meant there was a second exit or cracks in the vault through which the wind passed. He walked 300 paces deeper. The lantern illuminated the walls, and Ian saw traces of old mining work. Iron ore had been mined here. The veins were thin, poor. That was probably why the mine had been abandoned. It wasn't worth the effort. But Ian wasn't looking for ore. He was looking for clay. And he found it. In a side tunnel that led to an underground stream. A layer of gray-blue clay 2 cubits thick, soft, rich, with a fine grain. He took a handful, kneaded it in his fingers, rubbed it, held it up to the light. Good clay. Very good. Suitable for pottery, for molds, for kilns, for everything he had in mind. He filled a sack and carried it upstairs. At the castle, he showed the clay to Torvald. The one-armed blacksmith examined it. He bit into it out of old habit. He said the clay was good, better than the kind they take from the riverbank. Ian explained what he needed. Cheese molds, even, smooth, with holes for the whey to drain. 3 sizes, small ones for soft cheese, medium ones for semi-hard, large ones for aged. Torvald asked how many. Ian said 20 of each size to start with. Torvald whistled. He said that with one hand it would take a month's work. Ian said he'd find him an assistant. He found one that very day, a boy from Stenholm, 14 years old. An orphan, he lived with an aunt who fed him every other meal. His name was Nils, small, quiet, with quick hands. Torvald looked at him skeptically. Ian said to give the boy a chance. 3 days later, Nils was kneading clay like a pro. Torvald grumbled that the boy was getting in the way. But Ian noticed that the blacksmith had started teaching him, showing him how to properly beat the clay, how to drive out air bubbles, how to dry the molds so they wouldn't crack. Nils absorbed it all like a sponge. By the 5th week, Ian received the first 60 molds. Even, smooth, fired in the forge, beautiful. He arranged them in the cheese cellar, and Solveig stood there for a long time, running her fingers over them. She said they looked like little houses for cheese. Ian smiled. That's exactly what they were. Meanwhile, something else had happened. Blue steel. That rusty lock, covered in a bluish patina from Solveig's touch. Ian took it to Torvald, asked him to try working it. Torvald took a hammer and struck it. Bright blue sparks flew. The lock didn't deform. Torvald struck harder. The lock clanged but didn't give way. Torvald heated it in the forge. The metal heated up more slowly than usual. When it was finally red hot, Torvald placed it on the anvil and struck it. The metal gave way, but reluctantly, as if it were resisting. Torvald struck it for 10 minutes. He flattened the lock into a strip. He quenched it in water. He pulled it out. The strip was bluish with a metallic sheen. Torvald ran his fingernail along it, then a knife. The knife left no mark. He looked at Ian. He said he hadn't seen metal like this in 30 years at the anvil. Ian nodded. He asked if Torvald could make some blanks out of ordinary iron and put them in the cellar under Solveig's bedroom, for a few nights. Torvald asked why. Ian explained. Torvald listened in silence. When Ian finished, the blacksmith sat on a bench and stared at the floor. Then he raised his head and said that if it were true, the cursed princess had just given him more than 3 kings had in 30 years. She had given him the metal every blacksmith dreams of his life. He stood up. He bowed. Not to Ian, toward the castle. Toward where, behind the stone walls in the cheese dairy, Solveig was working. Ian put his hand on his shoulder and asked him not to tell anyone yet. It's too soon. People aren't ready. We need time. Torvald nodded. A week later, 20 iron blanks lay in the smithy, having come from the cellar beneath the bedroom. Each was covered with a bluish patina. Each had become harder than any steel in the kingdom. Torvald began working on them at night, quietly, alone. He forged slowly because the metal demanded patience. But what emerged from under his hammer was beautiful, smooth, bluish, light and strong at the same time. First he forged a knife, a kitchen knife, for Martha. He brought it to her in the morning. Martha took the knife. She cut a turnip. The knife went into the turnip like butter. Martha stopped. She looked at the blade, then at Torvald. She asked what it was. Torvald said it was blue steel, a gift from the princess. Martha turned the knife over in her hands. Then she pressed it to her chest like a child and went back to her kitchen. Torvald later told Ian that she didn't let the knife out of her hands until evening. Ian listened and thought, 20 blanks, that's not enough. Enough for knives, for tools, maybe for a few swords, but for trade he needed dozens, hundreds, and Solveig was alone. And her range was 15 meters. He needed more blanks. We need to optimize the layout in the cellar. We need to calculate how many nights are required for complete transformation. He began keeping records. Parchment was expensive. He wrote in small handwriting, with charcoal on scraps of leather. Bjorn found him an old book with blank pages in the former king's library. Ian began filling it in. Tables, graphs, diagrams, cellar temperature by day, cheese aging time, amount of milk per mold, salt consumption, metal transformation rate, Solveig's radius of effect. Bjorn glanced at the book once and didn't understand a thing, but the look on his face was as if he had witnessed witchcraft. Ian said it wasn't magic, it was accounting. Bjorn said that to him, it was one and the same. By the end of the 4th month, there were 200 molds in the cheese cellar, each containing cheese at different stages of aging. Soft, 3-day-old. Semi-hard, 3-week-old with honey. And the first experimental molds of 1-month-old jumpa, hard cheese, dense, golden, with crystals at the break like Parmesan. Ian broke the first wheel of the 1-month-aged cheese in the presence of Bjorn and Solveig. The aroma filled the cheese cellar, nutty, deep, with a hint of caramel and a distant whisper of mountain herbs. Solveig stood and looked at this wheel cheese, golden, with crystals, beautiful as a piece of jewelry. She touched it with her fingertips. She said quietly that she couldn't believe it was her. Bjorn stood nearby. The old butler had outlived 3 kings. He had seen famine and plague and empty cellars. He looked at this cheese and tears streamed down his cheeks. He wasn't shy about it. He tasted a piece. He chewed slowly with his bad teeth. The cheese was quite soft inside despite the hard rind. Ian had made it that way on purpose, for Bjorn. Soft on the inside, so it wouldn't hurt to eat. Bjorn didn't know that, but Ian did, and Solveig knew, because Ian had told her 3 weeks ago that he was making this cheese for Bjorn, for the man who had carried the castle on his shoulders for 32 years and deserved cheese he could eat without pain. In the 6th month, Ian threw a feast, not for himself, not for the castle, for the Valsern delegation that had arrived uninvited. 3 ambassadors in red cloaks with golden lyres, 12 guards, and 1 priest in a white cassock with cold eyes. They had come to look, to check, to make sure the impoverished north was perishing as it should. Bjorn reported their arrival with the face of a man who had seen wolves at the threshold. Haley stood at the gate and placed her hand on her sword. Ian said to let them in. Feed them, put them up. Haley looked at him as if he were mad. She said they were spies. Ian replied that that was exactly why they needed to be fed. Spies who leave hungry will tell one story. Spies who leave well-fed will tell a different story. He had been preparing for 3 days. Martha worked from morning till night. Una grew fresh herbs in the greenhouse in 2 days. Bunches of mint and basil and something resembling dill that Ian had found among the seeds from the south. Solveig didn't leave the cheese cellar. She was cooking. The finest wheels. Selected. Aged. A different cheese for every dish. Ian watched her work and understood what was happening. She was preparing to welcome people from Valzern, from the country that had cast her out like trash. And she wanted to show them something. Not tell them. To show. The feast took place on the evening of the 3rd day. The castle's great hall, a table covered with a clean tablecloth that Martha had kept for 30 years for a special occasion. Candles, lots of candles. In their light, the castle looked not shabby but ancient. There is a difference between poverty and antiquity, and candlelight knows that difference. The Valzern envoys sat down at the table with an expression of condescending patience. The senior envoy, a gray-haired man with thin lips and a ring bearing a coat of arms. Ian recognized him from Bjorn's report. Lord Henry Stauffen, the very man who, 17 years ago, had signed the order exiling Solveig to the Resonator Monastery. Ian stood. Everyone fell silent. He said he was glad to have the guests. He said that Holmgard was a poor kingdom and the meal would be simple. But whatever on it would be made here, by the hands of the people of Holmgard. Then he turned toward the door and held out his hand. Solveig stepped out from behind the door. Her silver hair was braided, a clean dress, not a gray convent one, blue. Martha had sewn it from one of the bales of fabric they'd brought, simple but beautiful. She'd taken off her apron, but her hands were the hands of a craftswoman, stained with herbs, with the smell of milk and cheese under her fingernails. She stood and looked straight ahead, not down, straight ahead. Ian said he wanted to introduce his wife, Solveig Callahan, Holmgard's master fermenter. Everything the guests would taste today existed thanks to her. The hall was silent. Lord Stauffen stared at Solveig without blinking. The priest in the white cassock pressed his lips together. Ian nodded to Martha. The first course was served, smoked trout on a wooden platter with sprigs of mountain mint, thin slices of golden flesh that melted on the tongue. The ambassadors ate in silence. One of the younger ones stopped mid-sentence and looked at the fish in surprise. The second course was served. 3 types of cheese on a stone slab, soft with wild garlic, semi-hard with mountain honey, and a month-aged hard cheese with crystals at the fracture. Beside it, fresh malt bread, and a small pot of dark mountain honey. Ian explained each cheese, calmly, like a master at a tasting. This soft one, aged 3 days, wild garlic from the northern slope, good with bread. This one with honey, 3 weeks, mountain honey, thyme-flavored, sweetness and salt. This one is the month-aged. You have to eat it slowly. It unfolds. The ambassadors tasted it. The room was quiet. Only the sound of chewing. Lord Stauffen took a piece of the month-old cheese, put it in his mouth, chewed slowly, stopped, put down his knife, chewed some more. His face was changing. The condescension was fading. Something else took its place. Surprise, then confusion, then something heavy and dark that Ian read as recognition. The old man realized that he had just been given a taste of the best cheese of his life, and that it had been made by the girl he had cast out like a curse. They served the third. Ale. Dark, thick, honey sour with a smoky aftertaste and that very same ghostly floral note. Bjorn poured it himself. His hands didn't tremble. His back was straight. He poured this ale like a man who knows the value of what's in his hands. The envoys drank. One of the younger ones set down his mug and said quietly that it was the best ale he'd ever tasted. The priest took a sip, set down his mug, didn't finish it, but his eyes narrowed. He was looking at Solveig, thinking, weighing things. Ian saw it and remembered. Dessert was served last, simple. Slices of fresh bread on malt, smeared with mountain honey and sprinkled with cheese crumbs. Una garnished each slice with a fresh mint leaf from her greenhouse. Greenery in November. The ambassadors exchanged glances. When dinner was over, Lord Stauffen stood up. The room fell silent. The old man stood there in silence for about 10 seconds. Then he turned to Solveig. She was standing by the wall, her hands in front of her, a habit. But her back was straight, and her eyes looked straight ahead. Stauffen spoke in a trembling voice. He asked for forgiveness. He called her a princess.
He said that the old man was asking for forgiveness. The hall was silent. Solvi stood there, her fingers clenched, then unclenched. She nodded, once, slowly. She didn't say she forgave him. She didn't say she didn't forgive him. She just nodded. And that was right. Because forgiveness isn't granted on demand at a feast. Forgiveness comes when it's ready, or it doesn't come. Both are fine, but later, much later. When the ambassadors had retired to their rooms, when the candles had burned out, when the castle had fallen silent. Solvi stood in the hallway and wept, not silently as she had on the first night, out loud, pressing her palms to her face. Ian stood beside her and didn't touch her. He waited. She cried for a minute, 2, 3. Then she lowered her hands, looked at him with wet gray eyes, and said what he hadn't expected. She said, "Thank you for not throwing her out on the first day." Ian wanted to reply. He couldn't, because his throat tightened. He just nodded, just as she had nodded to Stauffen, once, slowly. They stood in the dark hallway, 2 people the world had tried to break, one through death and a stranger's body, the other through 17 years of hatred. And they stood there, whole. Haley saw it from around the corner. She turned and went back to her room. In the room, she took out a whetstone. She placed the sword on her knees, and for the first time in 10 years, she began to sharpen it with a smile. Because, for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't ashamed to serve. The priest had left with the delegation, but his gaze remained lodged in Ian's mind like a splinter. Cold, appraising. The kind of gaze that looks not at a person, but at a problem. Ian asked Bjorn what he knew about the priest.
Bjorn made inquiries through merchant acquaintances. 2 weeks later, the answer came. The priest's name was Father Cassius, the right-hand man of Cardinal Leofric Ashton, Archbishop of Valzerne. The man who had ruled the Church of Resonance for 40 years and considered the destruction of the dissonance his life's work. Bjorn relayed this quietly in his office with the door closed. His face was ashen. He said that if Ashton had taken an interest in Holmgard, things were bad. Not the army, worse. A word. Ashton doesn't send soldiers. He sends letters. To every bishop, to every lord, to every merchant who depends on the church's blessing for his goods. One letter and Holmgard will be blockaded. Not a single caravan will come. Not a single merchant will buy a barrel of ale. Because the ale is made by the accursed, and buying from the accursed is a sin. Ian listened and nodded. He knew this type of enemy, not the one who strikes with a fist, the one who calls competitors and whispers. You can't fight against people like that. You have to be faster than them. You need the product to be on tables before the ban hits the shelves. He sprang into action. First, increase production. The cheese factory was running at full capacity, 4 vats, 200 molds, 1 Solveig. That wasn't enough. He needed a second line, one that didn't depend on Solveig's gift. Ordinary cheese, made from ordinary milk. Good, but ordinary. The kind any trained person could make. He called for Martha. He said he wanted to teach her how to make cheese from start to finish. Martha said she was 62 and it was too late to learn. Ian said that in his. He hesitated. He said he knew a woman who started making cheese at 65, and 2 years later her goat chèvre won first place at the fair. Martha asked what chèvre was. Ian said it was goat cheese, but different. Martha snorted and said, "Show me." A week later, Martha was making soft cheese herself. Not like Solveig's, without the nighttime transformation. Ordinary, but clean and tasty, and made right. Ian called it Northern Table Cheese. For everyday meals, for every home in Holmgard. He called Solveig's cheese Moon Cheese, because it was born at night. Moon Cheese was for export, for those who pay in gold. Northern Table Cheese was for their own people, for the 12,000 people who need to eat every day. Second, expand trade. Ragnar Holm had already come 3 times. Each time he took more. Each time he paid more. But one merchant isn't enough. Ian found 2 more. A spice merchant from Marenhall named Lisa, who took an interest in smoked trout, and a young merchant from the eastern kingdom of Dryholm named Wang Shu, who tasted the moon cheese at the fair and came to Holmgard in person to buy 10 wheels. Ian didn't sell him 10 wheels. He sold him 5, and said the remaining 5 would be ready in a month. Wang Shu asked why. Ian explained that moon cheese takes time. It can't be rushed. You can't make more than the process allows. It's not a mass-produced commodity. It's handcrafted, and every wheel is numbered. Wang Shui listened, and his eyes fought. He was a merchant. He understood what was happening. Limited edition, numbering, history. This isn't cheese. It's a luxury. He paid as much for 5 rounds as ordinary cheese cost for 50, and he left happy. Third, people. Ian understood he couldn't do everything himself. He needed craftsmen, trained, loyal. He started with those who were already close by. Oscar the scribe became his secretary. The boy with big ears and terrible handwriting turned out to be surprisingly good with numbers. He calculated faster than Bjorn. He remembered everything. Ian taught him to keep the ledgers: incoming, outgoing, balance. Oscar mastered it in a week, and within a month he was keeping 4 ledgers at once. Niels was already making the molds himself in Torvald's smithy. Simple but even. Torvald grumbled, but it was clear he was pleased. The boy worked silently and diligently. He ate 3 times a day, for the first time in his life. Haley recruited 5 more guards from the villages, young, hungry, untrained. She trained them every morning in the courtyard. Ian heard the clang of wooden swords outside the window, and that sound was a good one. It meant growth, movement, life. In the 7th month, Ian woke up in the middle of the night from a strange sensation. Not a sound, not a movement, a sensation. As if something very large and very distant had turned in its sleep. He lay on the bedroom floor and listened. Solveig was breathing evenly. The castle creaked as always. The wind outside the window, nothing unusual. But the sensation wouldn't go away. Heavy, deep, like a rumble beneath the floor. Like a vibration you feel not with your ears but with your bones. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked east. There, beyond the hills and the abandoned mine, stood a mountain. Dark, unnamed on the maps of Holmgard, just a mountain. But now Ian looked at it and felt that the mountain was looking back at him. He stood by the window for 10 minutes. Then he lay back down. He didn't fall asleep until morning. In the morning, he asked Bjorn if there were any legends about the mountain to the east. Bjorn said there was one old tale, about a dragon, sleeping beneath the mountain. 300 years, maybe more. A fairy tale, just a fairy tale. Children tell it by the campfire. Ian nodded. A fairy tale. A dragon. 300 years. He wrote it down in his book. Next to the tables on cheese aging and salt consumption. Because he was an engineer. And engineers write everything down. Even what they don't understand. Especially what they don't understand. A letter arrived that afternoon. From Walzern. With a seal not from the royal chancellery but from the church. A golden lyre on white wax. Bjorn brought it with a pale face. Ian opened it. He read it slowly. The letter was from Cardinal Leofric Ashton. Polite, impeccably polite. It stated that the Church of Resonance was concerned by rumors that in Holmgard the accursed princess was involved in the production of consumer goods. That this might pose a spiritual danger to consumers. That the church was sending a commission of inquisitors to verify the purity of production. The commission would arrive in 2 months. Ian folded the letter. He placed it on the table. He looked at Bjorn. Bjorn said that this was the beginning of the end. Ian said no. This was the beginning of the beginning. They had 2 months. A great deal could be accomplished in 2 months. Bjorn asked what exactly. Ian said that the inquisitors would come to inspect, so they needed to give them something to inspect. A clean production process. Flawless. No witchcraft. No magic. Just hands. Just milk. Just time and temperature and salt. He'll show them every step. From cow to cheese mold. From barley to ale. He'll show them that the princess's curse has nothing to do with the product. That cheese is made by hands, not magic. Bjorn said that was a lie. Ian shook his head. He said no. Solveig doesn't cast spells on the cheese. She makes it with her hands. Like any master. The fact that milk gets better at night isn't magic. It's a natural property. Like rain. Like the sun. Rain waters the fields. No one calls a farmer a sorcerer just because it rains on his field. Bjorn opened his mouth, closed it, thought. Opened it again and said that this was the most beautiful logic he'd ever heard in his life. And that the inquisitors would tear it to shreds. Ian smiled. He said, "We'll see," and that he'd let the inquisitors taste the cheese too. Because it's hard to declare heretical something that's a feast in your mouth. The inquisitors arrived 3 weeks early, without warning. 4 horsemen in white cloaks with golden lyres on their chests. Father Cassius rode in front. Behind him were three young priests with the faces of men performing a sacred duty. Haley saw them from the tower and ran to Ian. She said they were here. Ian set down the knife he'd been using to cut turnips for Martha. He wiped his hands. He told her to let them in. Haley said he was as calm as a corpse. Ian replied that corpses don't cut turnips. Haley snorted, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. She stood beside him at the gate as Cassius dismounted. The priest looked just as he had at the feast, thin, straightforward, with eyes that held nothing personal, only function. He said that a commission from the Church of Resonance had arrived to inspect the spiritual purity of production in Holmgard. He said they had the right to inspect any room, to question any resident, to seize any object arousing suspicion, by order of Cardinal Ashton. Ian nodded. He said they could inspect everything, every cellar, every barrel, every storeroom. He would show them around personally, but first he offered them something to eat after their journey. Cassius refused. He said they weren't there for meals. Ian didn't insist. He led them to the cheese dairy. The first young priest looked around with distaste, the second with curiosity. The third wrote everything down in a notebook in small letters. Ian demonstrated each step. Here is the milk. Ordinary cow's milk from the village of Stenholm. Here is the straining cloth. Linen. Here is the salt. Sea salt from the south. Here are the molds. Clay, made here from local clay. Here are the aging shelves. Here is the 3-day-old cheese. Here is the 3-week-old. Here is the 1-month-old. Cassius listened without interrupting. Then he asked where the princess fit into all this. Ian said that the princess works in the cheese dairy every day, as a master, with her own hands. She strains it, she salts it, she shapes it, she turns the molds. Cassius asked if she uses her gift in the process. Ian asked what exactly Cassius meant by gift. Cassius said that everyone knows that the fourth princess of Valzern carries dissonance, that her presence poisons matter. Ian shook his head. He said he'd been living with the princess for 6 months and hadn't seen any poisoning. The milk doesn't sour prematurely. The cheese doesn't rot. The meat doesn't spoil. Everything is fine. Cassius stared at him without blinking. Then he turned to one of the young priests. The priest took a small silver tuning fork out of his bag, a resonator, a church device for detecting dissonance. The priest struck the tuning fork and held it up to the barrel of ale. The tuning fork rang out evenly, a pure tone. He held it up to the cheese molds, an even tone. To the milk, even. To the walls, to the shelves, to every object in the cheese dairy, an even tone everywhere. Cassius frowned. The priest held the tuning fork up to Ian, an even tone. The note of his soul was so middle of the road that the resonator barely registered it. Then Cassius said he wanted to see the princess. Ian brought Solvi. She entered the cheese cellar with her back straight and her hands at her sides, not clasped in front of her, at her sides. Ian noticed this, and something warm stirred in his chest. The priest held the tuning fork up to Solvi, and the tuning fork wailed. It didn't ring, it wailed, a thin, piercing sound that made everyone in the cellar wince. Dissonance, powerful, unmistakable. Cassius nodded with the expression of a man who had found what he was looking for. He said that the princess carried dissonance, that any product made in her presence could be, that he was obliged to seize all products for inspection and destruction. Ian stood calmly. He had expected this. He was prepared. He said that the tuning fork revealed the note of the princess's soul, not the note of the cheese. If the tuning fork is held up to the cheese, it sounds pure. Cassius had just checked this himself, so the product is pure, regardless of who made it. Cassius paused. Ian continued. He said that a one-armed blacksmith worked in the Holmgard smithy. His hammer could also be tested with the tuning fork. The hammer sounded pure. But the horseshoes he forged were crooked because he had only one arm. Did that mean the hammer was to blame? No. A product is judged by the product itself, not by the craftsman. Cassius was silent. One of the young priests, the one who was watching with curiosity rather than disdain, nodded slightly. Ian saw it. He remembered it. Cassius said that logic is worldly, but the church is guided by the law of resonance. Dissonance is contagious. That is dogma. It is not up for discussion. Ian said he wasn't arguing with dogma. He proposed a test, a simple one. Let the inquisitors take 3 pieces of cheese, one from Solveig's cheese dairy, one from Martha's line, where Solveig had never been, and one brought from Valzern. Let them test all 3 with a tuning fork. If the tuning fork distinguishes Solveig's cheese from the others,
then Cassius is right. Cassius looked at him for a long time. Then he agreed. 3 pieces of cheese lay on the table, identical in appearance. The young priest held the tuning fork to each one. 3 times, a clear, even tone. No difference. Cassius stood with a stony face. Then he said that the tuning fork checks the note, not the taste, and that spiritual contamination might be subtler than sound. Ian replied that if contamination is subtler than any instrument capable of detecting it, then how can one distinguish contamination from the absence of contamination? Cassius did not answer. The young priest with curious eyes hid a smile. Ian noticed that too. The inquisitors stayed for 3 days. Cassius checked everything: the cellars, the kitchen, the smithy, Yuna's greenhouse, the bedrooms,
every corner of the castle. The tuning fork rang out clearly everywhere except Solveig herself. The food was clean, the rooms were clean, the people were clean. Only she sounded different, but everything she did sounded just like everything else. Cassius found not a single trace of infection, not a single one, and that infuriated him. Ian saw his jaw clench, saw the knuckles on his rosary turn white. The priest was used to obedience, used to fear, used to his mere presence settling matters. Here he was met with politeness and cheese, and that was worse than resistance. On the evening of the second day, Ian invited the inquisitors to dinner. Cassius declined again, but the 3 young men came. Ian fed them: smoked trout, 3 kinds of cheese, malt bread, ale. They ate in silence. Then the young man, the one with the curious eyes, asked quietly how this honey cheese was made. Ian explained, in detail, like a master to a master. The young priest listened, his eyes shining. He said that in his home village in the west, they also made cheese. Simple, goat cheese. But his mother could never get it to turn out like this. Ian asked what kind of milk they used. The priest said goat's milk, full fat, but the cheese always crumbled. Ian nodded. He said that goat cheese crumbles if you add too much salt too early. You have to salt it later, when the curd is already firm, and not with sea salt, but with fine salt. The priest listened and nodded. Then he said quietly that his mother would be glad to know that. On the 3rd day, Cassius announced that the commission was leaving, that a report would be drafted and sent to Cardinal Ashton, that the decision was up to the cardinal. He mounted his horse and rode off without looking back. 2 young priests rode after him. The 3rd, the one with the curious eyes, lingered at the gate. He looked at Ian, then at the castle, then at the mountains beyond the castle. He asked quietly if it was true that the king accepted anyone who wanted to work. Ian said it was true. The young priest nodded. He turned his horse around and rode after the others. Haley stood nearby. She said that this one would return. Ian said he knew. 6 weeks later, the young priest returned, alone, without his white cloak, without his tuning fork, in simple clothes with a knapsack on his back. His name was Brother Matthias. He said he had left the order, that he couldn't serve people who called good cheese heresy, that he wanted to learn. Ian gave him an apron and put him to work in the cheese dairy. In the 8th month, Elsa Bergstrom arrived in Holmgard. She didn't just arrive, she walked here, 12 days on foot, from a mountain village that no longer existed. It had been burned down, because the blacksmith's wife who lived there did strange things with metal. Elsa was tall, broad-shouldered. Her hands were covered in burns and scars from sparks, a hammer on her back, soot on her face, nothing beneath the soot. The emptiness of a person who had lost everything and hadn't yet decided why to keep going. Haley brought her to Ian. Elsa stood there and said nothing. Ian asked what she could do. Elsa said she was a blacksmith. Ian asked what had happened to the village. Elsa said it had been burned down. One word, no details. Ian didn't press her for more. He led her to Torvald. The blacksmith looked at her, at the hammer behind her back, at her hands. He nodded. He gave her a spot at the anvil. Elsa stood at the bellows and stoked the fire with a single pump of the bellows. Torvald watched her work and after 5 minutes turned to Ian with the expression of a man who'd just been shown how to walk all over again. She was forging. Silently, steadily, every blow precise. Every movement was economical. And when her palm touched the red-hot metal, the metal changed. It turned blue. It hardened. It became that very impossible alloy that Torvald could only produce after nights spent in the cellar beneath Solveig's bedroom. Elsa did it instantly, with a single touch. Torvald sat down on a bench and watched. Then he quietly told Ian that he had nothing to teach her. She was better. Ian shook his head. He said that Torvald knows the forms, knows what the castle needs, knows how to forge with one hand for 30 years and not give up. Elsa knows how to transform metal. Torvald knows how to make things out of metal. Together, they'll make what neither of them can make alone. Torvald looked at Elsa. Elsa looked at Torvald. Two blacksmiths, one old and one-handed, the other young and cursed. They nodded to each other, without words. Blacksmiths don't need words. A week later, the first blue steel sword emerged from the forge. Haley took it in her hands. She twirled it. She slashed at the air. Then she struck an old shield hanging on the wall of the training yard. The sword sank into the oak like butter. Haley pulled it out. She looked at the blade. Not a scratch. She turned to Ian and said that a sword like this was worth a village. Ian said they wouldn't be selling swords just yet. Only knives, tools, horseshoes, items that didn't reek of war. Haley asked why. Ian said that if Cardinal Ashton found out that Holmgard was forging weapons from magical metal, it wouldn't be a spiritual test anymore. It would be an army. And 30 guards against 100,000 isn't a fight. It's suicide. Haley pressed her lips together. But she nodded. She understood. The sword was put away in the armory. Elsa settled in quietly. She spoke little. 10 words a day, maybe 15. She ate in the corner of the kitchen, alone. She slept on a bench in the smithy because she was used to the heat of the forge. Una tried to talk to her. Elsa answered in monosyllables. Una wasn't offended. She came back again. She brought her pieces of cheese and bread from the kitchen. Elsa ate and said nothing. But one day Una noticed that Elsa had shifted over on the bench. She made room next to her. Una sat down. They sat in silence for 10 minutes. Then Una started chatting about how the beans in the greenhouse were growing crooked, and she couldn't figure out why. Elsa listened. Then she said the soil was too dense. She needed to add ash. Una fell silent in surprise. Then she jumped up and ran to the greenhouse. A day later, the beans had straightened out. Una ran to Elsa and told her she was a genius. Elsa turned away. But Una later swore she saw the corners of her lips twitch. In the 9th month, what Ian had feared happened. At night, after midnight, Solveig woke up to a scream. Ian jumped up from the floor. Noise in the hallway, footsteps, the clang of steel. Haley burst into the bedroom with a sword in her hand and blood on her cheek. She said briefly, "An assassin," through the wall. He was climbing toward the bedroom window. A guard noticed a shadow on the wall. One of the new guards managed to intercept him. The assassin wounded him in the shoulder, but the guard held him until Haley arrived. The assassin is dead. He fell from the wall when Haley chopped off his hand along with the rope. Ian stood up. He walked over to Solveig. She was sitting on the bed, trembling. Not from the cold, from realization. He was reaching for her, not for Ian, for her. Ian sat down beside her, without touching her. She turned to him and asked why. Why did they want to kill her? She hadn't done anything to anyone. Ian remained silent, because the answer was simple and cruel. She was worth money. Her gift was worth money. And someone wanted either to obtain that gift or to destroy it so that others wouldn't get it. He didn't say that. He said he was there, and that it wouldn't happen again. In the morning, he examined the killer's body. A mercenary, a professional. A tattoo on his wrist. Bjorn recognized the mark. The Guild of Nightblades from Valzern. Expensive. Very expensive. Someone had paid a price for Solveig equal to the cost of a house in the capital. Ian stood over the body and felt something shifting inside him. He was an engineer, a peaceful man, a cheese-making consultant from Portland, Oregon. He had never fought, never raised his voice, never wanted to hurt anyone. But now he stood looking at the body of a man who had climbed toward his wife's window to kill her. And inside him, something cold and heavy fell into place, like a cog that had been waiting for this moment. He raised his head. He looked at Haley. He spoke quietly and evenly. He said that starting today, 2 guards would stand at the bedroom door every night, that the castle walls needed to be inspected and every crack through which someone could crawl sealed, that he needed a list of everyone who had entered Holmgard in the last month, every merchant, every traveler, every beggar, and that Elsa would forge bars for the bedroom windows out of blue steel that no one could break. Haley listened, and something changed in her eyes. She had seen kings who gave orders. She had seen kings who panicked. She saw kings who hid. This one stood over a dead assassin and spoke calmly, not because he wasn't afraid, because he knew what to do. She stood up straight, saluted, for the first time. a proper military salute, and went to carry out the order. That evening, Ian sat alone in the kitchen. It was late. The castle slept. He looked at his hands that knew how to cut cheese and knead dough and adjust the temperature in fermentation chambers, the hands of a craftsman, not a warrior. Haley entered quietly. She sat down across from him, without being invited. They were silent for a minute. Then Haley said that the guard the assassin had wounded would live. The wound is clean. It will heal. Ian nodded. Haley was silent for a moment longer. Then she said that she had served people for 10 years who weren't worth her sword, that she was tired of it, and that he was the first person in 10 years she trusted, not because he's strong, because he doesn't pretend to be strong. He just does what needs to be done, every day, even when it's scary. Ian looked at her. Red hair, a scar across her eyebrow, eyes tired but clear. He said he was lucky to have her as captain of the guard. Haley snorted, but she didn't leave. They sat in silence for another 10 minutes, and that silence was warm. By the end of the first year, Holmgard had changed. Not beyond recognition. The castle walls were still gray and jagged. The roofs were patched. The horses hadn't gotten much fatter, but the changes were elsewhere. In the smell. The castle smelled. Of cheese and smoked meat and fresh bread and honey and smoke from the forge. It was the smell of life. The smell of work. The smell of a place worth returning to. 4 cursed ones now lived in the castle. Solveig, Una, Elsa, and Aya Lim, who had arrived last, quietly, without fanfare. She simply appeared at the gate one morning in the habit of a novice from the Resonator convent. Thin, pale, with eyes that had seen too much. She was 20 years old, but looked 15. She said she could hear falsehood. In people, lies and fear and secret intentions. The monastery had used her as an interrogation tool for 8 years. She interrogated people with her hearing. She sat in a corner and told the investigators whether a person was telling the truth or not. 8 years of other people's lies and other people's fear in her head. She left when she heard that even the abbess was lying. Always. To everyone. Even to herself. Ian listened and didn't check. He didn't ask her to demonstrate. He gave her a room, a quiet one, in the far wing, where there were few people and little noise. Ayana shut herself in for 3 days. She didn't come out. Martha brought her food and left it under the door. On the 4th day, Ayana came out, pale but calm. She approached Ian and said quietly that he was the first person she had heard who wasn't fake. There are doubts, there are fears, there is weariness, but there is no deceit. Ian didn't know how to respond. Ayana said she wanted to help. Ian asked how. She said she could check people, merchants, envoys, guests, hear who came with honest intentions and who came with a knife behind their back. Ian thought about it. Then he said it was useful, but on one condition. She didn't have to listen all the time. She chose when and whom. And if she got tired, she'd say so and rest. Her gift wasn't a cage. Ayana looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, and she stayed. She became a shadow by Ian's side, silent, invisible. When merchants arrived, she stood in the corner. When they left, she approached Ian and spoke softly. This one is honest, this one isn't. This one is afraid but doesn't lie. This one lies but isn't dangerous. Ian listened and took it into account. But he never made decisions based solely on her words. Because Ayana's gift was a weapon, and weapons must be used with caution. Meanwhile, Min-Soo Cho arrived in Holmgard in the 5th month with a salt caravan and stayed. She was the daughter of a merchant from the southern port. 22 years old, glasses, a ledger, and a mind that could calculate faster than Oscar and Bjorn combined. She had come to sell salt. She saw Ian haggling with Ragnar. She stood and listened for 20 minutes. Then she walked over and told Ian that he had sold it 13% too cheaply. Ian looked at her in surprise. She showed him the calculation in the ledger. He was right. She was right. He asked who she was. Min-Soo introduced herself and said she was looking for a business venture worth her time. Ian asked if she wanted to become Holmgard's treasurer and sales representative. Min-Soo asked what percentage of the deals she would receive. Ian named a figure. Min-Soo haggled for 15 minutes. They reached an agreement. She stayed that very day. Within a month, Holmgard's trade had doubled. Min-Soo found 6 new buyers. She negotiated salt deliveries at a price 20% lower than what Bjorn had been paying. She organized the wagon routes so that each one traveled in a loop, out with ale and cheese, back with salt and cloth and tools. Not a single wagon traveled empty. Ian watched her work and realized he had found someone who could do what he couldn't. He knew how to create a product. She knew how to sell it. Together, they were more dangerous than an army. At the council meeting Ian convened at the end of the first year, There were 8 people seated. Bjorn, Haley, Martha, Minsu, Oscar, Torvald, Matthias, and Solveig. Ian looked at them. A gray-haired butler, a red-haired warrior, a cook with red hands, a merchant woman in glasses, a boy scribe, a one-armed blacksmith, a former inquisitor, and a silver princess in a burlap apron. This was his council, his team, his family. He said that in a year Holmgard had stopped starving, that the treasury had quadrupled, that the warehouses held enough salt and grain to last until spring, that there were 400 molds in the cheese dairy, that there was blue steel in the forge, that the trade routes were working, that people were eating 3 meals a day. Bjorn was crying, quietly, without restraint. For 32 years he had carried the castle on his shoulders and watched everything crumble. And now, in a single year, the boy who'd asked about grain first had turned everything upside down. Ian said the good news was over. Now for the bad. Cardinal Ashton was preparing a response. Cassius's report had gone to Valzerne, without proof of infection. But that won't stop Ashton. He'll find another way. Not a spiritual one, a commercial one. He'll declare a blockade. Minsu nodded. She'd already heard from her merchants. Whispers were spreading through the southern cities. The bishops were sending out letters. Don't buy from Holmgard. Cursed food. Sin. Poison. For now, these were rumors. Soon, it would become a decree. Ian said they had 2 or 3 months before the blockade became a reality. During that time, one thing must be done. Plant the product so widely that it would be impossible to uproot it. Every tavern, every market, every table in every city from Manhwa to the capital of Valzerne. People had to taste it, remember the flavor, want more. And then let Ashton try to tell them it was a sin. We'll see what wins out. Fear of the church or the taste of good cheese? Minso smiled, for the first time in front of everyone. She said it was the craziest marketing strategy she'd ever heard, and that she was starting right away. For 3 months, Minso worked like a woman possessed. 12 caravans left Holmgard in 12 different directions. Each carried barrels of ale and wheels of cheese and smoked fish and blue steel knives. Each carried a story. Minso wrote it herself, short, simple, on parchment in Oscar's beautiful handwriting. About the northern kingdom where they make cheese by moonlight. About honey from the mountains where thyme blooms. About ale aged in oak barrels with resin for 6 weeks. Not a word about a curse, not a word about magic, just craftsmanship, just taste, just a story that sounds beautiful when you drink ale by the fireplace. Ian read her text and said that in his past life, this was called branding. Minsu asked what branding was. Ian explained. Minsu thought for a moment and said that she had been doing this her whole life. She just didn't know it had a name. Moonlight cheese became a legend in 2 months. Each round is numbered. On each one is an imprint of a small moon that Elsa carved from blue steel. The serial number, the aging date, the weight. Minsu sold it only to select buyers, only to those who could appreciate it, only to those who would tell others. Wang Shui from Dreholm became the chief ambassador for moon cheese in the East. He hosted tastings for lords and merchants, and every tasting ended with orders. Ragnar Holm took the ale south and told every innkeeper that these were the last barrels, that there might not be any next time. It wasn't true, but Ragnar knew that scarcity sells better than advertising. Minso pretended not know about it. Lisa of Marenhall sold smoked trout to the lord's wives, and the lord's wives served it at dinners, and every dinner began with the question of where the fish came from. When the blow came, it came quietly, without armies, without trumpets, in a letter with 3 seals. Cardinal Leofric Ashton, in the name of the Church of Resonance, declared a trade excommunication against Holmgard. Anyone who buys Holmgard products commits a spiritual crime. Anyone who transports them is subject to ecclesiastical trial. Anyone who sells them is subject to excommunication. The seals were affixed to decrees that were sent to every city, to every port, to every trading post on the continent. Minsu brought the decree to Ian, her face as white as paper. Ian read it. He put it on the table. He looked out the window. Snow was falling outside. The first snow of the second winter in Holmgard. He stood and thought for 2 minutes. Then he turned to Minso and asked how much of the goods were already in the markets. Minso checked the ledger.
She said 800 wheels of moon cheese, 300 wheels of northern table cheese, 120 barrels of ale, 200 bundles of smoked trout, 400 blue steel knives, all of it already sold, already in homes, already on tables, already in mouths. Ian nodded. He said that Ashton was 2 months too late. The goods have already been distributed. Now the blockade isn't hitting Holmgard.
It's hitting the people who've already grown accustomed to the taste. Taking bread away from a person is hard. Taking away the bread a person has come to love is impossible. Minsu said the new convoys won't get through. The roads will be blocked by church outposts. Ian agreed. Direct shipments have ended. But Ragnar Holm doesn't just transport ale. He transports furs and timber. And if by chance there happen to be 10 wheels of cheese at the bottom of the wagon in every shipment of furs, who's going to check? Minsu looked at him. She said it was smuggling. Ian said it was trade under conditions of an unjust ban. Minsu thought for 5 seconds. Then she opened the ledger and began counting the routes. Winter was in full force. Snow had buried the mountain passes. The roads were blocked. The blockade was now twofold, imposed by the church and by nature. But Holmgard was ready. The warehouses were full. There was salt. There was grain. Meat was smoked and salted. Fish were caught from under the ice. Una grew greens and beans in the greenhouse. Solveig worked in the cheese dairy every day. Cheese was aging on the shelves. Ale was fermenting in barrels. Life went on. Ian used the winter to do what he had been putting off. He began to teach. Not just one person. Everyone. He gathered 20 people from the villages in the castle's great hall, men and women, young and old, and he began to explain how to make cheese, how to smoke fish, how to salt meat, how to bake bread with malt, how to brew ale. 3 hours every evening. He stood at the table and demonstrated. Solveig helped. She stood nearby and showed them how to strain and how to salt. Una showed them how to germinate grain for malt. Matthias wrote down everything Ian said in a thick book. Every recipe, every proportion, every technique. Ian told Matthias that this book was the most important thing in the castle. It more important than a sword, more important than gold. Because gold can be stolen, a sword can be broken. But the knowledge in the minds of 20 people cannot be stolen. Matthias wrote carefully, every letter, with a love for the craft that Ian had previously seen only in the best farmers. The 20 students scattered to the villages. Each took cheese molds, each took a sack of salt, each took away knowledge. A month later, the villages of Holmgard were making cheese. Simple, northern table cheese. Without moonlight, without magic. Just good, honest cheese made from milk and salt and patience. But it changed everything. Because now 12,000 people were eating cheese every day. For the first time. Never before had cheese been made in Holmgard. Milk was drunk raw, or it soured and was poured out. Now every drop of milk was put to use. Nothing went to waste. Waste was close to zero. The system worked. Ian stood on the castle wall and looked down at the villages below. Smoke rose from every chimney. Not the smoke of need. Smoke of work. Smoke from smokehouses, ovens, and cheese cellars. And he thought that this was why he had been brought here. Not for wars, not for magic. For this, so that people could eat. Spring of the second year came early. The snow melted in a week. The roads opened up. And the first thing to come along them wasn't a trade caravan. It was people. 30 families. From the southern kingdoms. With carts and children and livestock. They were heading for Holmgard. Because they'd heard that up north there was a place where they fed you. Where they taught you. Where they didn't chase you away. Minsu stood at the gate and counted. 142 people. 20 cows. 30 goats. 5 horses. Seeds. Tools. Ian went out to them, and the first thing he asked was how many craftsmen were among them. Hands went up. 3 carpenters, 2 masons, 1 cooper, 2 weavers, a baker, and an old man who said he knew how to make glass. Ian looked at the old man. He asked if it was true. The old man said he had been making glass for 40 years in Dryholm until the guild inspector shut down his workshop for non-payment of fees. Ian turned to Bjorn and told him to settle everyone in. Bjorn nodded. No questions, no doubts. He just nodded and went to do it. The population of Holmgard grew by 142 people in a single day. A week later, another 40 arrived. 2 weeks later, another 20. People were heading north, against common sense, against geography, against everything the church had told them. They were going where they could find food. Ian understood what was happening. The blockade of Ashton hadn't just hit Holmgard. It had hit the people who bought Holmgard goods. The innkeepers lost their best ale. Merchants lost their best-selling goods. Ordinary people lost the cheese they had come to love. And some of them decided that if they couldn't buy it, they could go where it was made. In the third month of spring, what Ian had both expected and feared came to pass. In the main square of the capital, Valzerne, the church staged a public burning of Holmgard goods. Confiscated barrels of ale, wheels of moon cheese, blue steel knives, everything was piled into a heap. Cardinal Ashton stood on a platform and gave a speech. About defilement, about contagion, about sin, about how the accursed princess poisons the world with her breath. The crowd listened, in silence. They set it alight. The barrels burst into flames, the cheese began to melt and burn, and the smell spread across the square, the smell of burning moon cheese, thick, warm, sweetish from the honey, with a hint of thyme and smoke. An old woman in the front row leaned forward. She knew that smell. She had bought that cheese from Lisa of Marenhall 2 months ago. She had eaten it with bread and cried at the taste because, at 60 years old, it was the best cheese of her life, and now they were burning it right under her nose. She stepped forward. She bent down. She picked up a piece of the melted wheel that had rolled out of the pile. Hot, sticky, burning her fingers. She took a bite. The inquisitor next to her opened his mouth to stop her. He was too late. The man behind her stepped forward. He picked up another piece. The woman next to him, a boy of about 12. A merchant in an apron. An old man with a cane. 10 people, 20, 50. The crowd moved toward the fire. Not running, slowly, calmly, like people walking to a table. They tore the cheese apart with their hands. Hot, melted, smeared with ash. They ate, standing, silently, watching the cardinal on the platform. Ashton stood and watched. His face was pale. He had spoken for 40 years and people had always listened to him. They feared him. His word was law. And now his word was burning in the fire, and the people were eating that fire and asking for seconds. The inquisitors didn't know what to do. You can't beat people for eating. You can't arrest a crowd. You can't burn what's already in their mouths. Ashton stepped from the platform. He got into the carriage. He drove off, in silence. For the first time in 40 years he had lost. Not to an army, not to a mage, not to a king. He had lost to cheese. The news reached Holmgard 10 days later. Ragnar Holm brought it personally. He rode through the gates on a foaming horse and laughed so hard that Haley grabbed her sword, thinking he was drunk. Ragnar told everything, in detail, about the bonfire, about the old woman, about the crowd, about the cardinal's face. Bjorn listened and shook his head. Martha listened and wiped her eyes with her apron. Haley listened and smiled her rare, hard smile. Una listened and bounced up and down on the spot. Elsa listened in silence. But Torvald later said he saw her smile. For the first time ever, Ayana stood in the corner and listened.
Then she walked over to Ian and quietly said that Ragnar wasn't lying. Not a single word. Ian nodded. He knew. Minsu had already done the math. She said the blockade was broken. Not formally. Formally, the decree was still in effect. But in practice, no merchant would turn down goods that people were pulling out of the fire with their bare hands. It was the best advertising in history. Ian stood there listening and nodding. But he was thinking about something else. He was thinking about Solveig. She wasn't in the hall. He found her in the cheese cellar, alone. She was standing by the shelves of cheese, touching the wheels with her fingertips. As always, quietly, gently, he walked in. She turned around. He told her about the bonfire, about the old woman, about the crowd eating her cheese from the fire. Solveig listened. Her face didn't change. Then she sat down on a bench, folded her hands in her lap, was silent for a minute, too. Ian sat down beside her, without touching her.
Just like on the first night. Solveig raised her head. Her eyes were wet, but not from grief, from something else. She said quietly that she'd spent her whole life thinking she was the cause of other people's misfortune, that everything she did brought people sorrow, and now people were climbing into the fire to taste what she'd made with her own hands. She fell silent. Then she did something she hadn't done once in all this time. She placed her hand on Ian's shoulder, on her own, without prompting, without fear. She just placed it there, a light, warm hand on his shoulder. And she said, "Thank you for not throwing me out on the first day." Ian turned to her, and she didn't look away. For the first time in her life, her gray eyes looked straight into his, without fear, without apology. Like a person who had finally found her place. They sat like that for a minute, or an hour. Ian didn't count. The warm cheese dairy smelled of milk and salt and mountain herbs. Cheese was ripening on the shelves. Behind the wall, Una was dropping something in the greenhouse and cursing. In the smithy, Elsa's hammer clanged. In the courtyard, Haley was herding the guards. In the office, Min-Soo was counting the profits. In the kitchen, Martha was cutting turnips with a new blue steel knife. In the library, Matthias was writing recipes in a book. Bjorn stood in the doorway, looking at the mountains, and for the first time in 32 years, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. And far to the east, beyond the hills and mines, beneath a dark, nameless mountain, something huge and ancient opened one eye. Golden, the size of a shield, and it closed it again. Not yet, but soon. Ian sat in his cheese cellar, next to the girl who made the world tastier every night, and thought that in a past life he hadn't finished the batch of blue cheese for Martha from Portland. But maybe what he was doing here was more important. Maybe one batch of blue cheese was worth the whole world. He didn't know. But the cheese on the shelves was aging. The ale was fermenting in the barrels. People outside the walls were eating, and that was enough. For today, that was enough.